A cold autumn wind swept through the isolated mountain town of Black Ridge, Colorado. Thick clouds covered the sky, and by nightfall the streets had become completely deserted. The only building still glowing in the darkness was Black Ridge Regional Hospital, where doctors and nurses continued their endless battle between life and death. Inside the hospital worked Dr. Joseph Hale, one of the most respected physicians in town. People admired him because he always appeared calm, confident, and professional. Patients trusted him without question, and the hospital staff believed there was almost nothing he couldn't handle. But behind that reputation was another side of Joseph. He hated failure. He believed making a mistake was worse than death itself. For years he had built the image of being the perfect doctor, and he refused to let anyone destroy it. On a cold Thursday evening, just before midnight, the emergency department doors burst open. Paramedics rushed inside carrying a man on a stretcher. His name was Veranzo Cole. He was 34 years old, an architect from Portland who'd been driving home after a business meeting when he suddenly collapsed on the highway. Although he was in serious condition, he was still conscious. His breathing was weak, his heartbeat was unstable, yet he could still speak. As nurses surrounded him, Veranzo grabbed Dr. Joseph's wrist. "Doctor," his voice trembled, "I don't want to die." Joseph looked directly into his frightened eyes. "You won't!" Those 3 words were enough to calm Veranzo. He believed he was safe. He had no idea those would be the last comforting words he would ever hear. The emergency room became a blur of activity. Machines beeped, doctors called out instructions, nurses hurried from one side of the room to the other. Joseph examined Veranzo's medical records while giving orders. Everything was moving quickly, too quickly. His mind was already exhausted after nearly 18 hours without proper rest. He skimmed through the paperwork instead of carefully reviewing every detail. A nurse quietly mentioned there was an important note in Veranzo's chart that needed to be checked before continuing treatment. Joseph barely looked up. "I've got this." His confidence left no room for questions. Minutes later, Veranzo's condition suddenly became worse. His breathing grew shallow. His body reacted violently. The monitors echoed through the room. The medical team fought desperately to stabilize him. Joseph realized something was terribly wrong. He searched through the file once more. Then he finally saw the warning he had overlooked. A critical medical alert. His face turned pale. His hands became cold. One simple mistake had changed everything. Veranzo remained alive, but only barely. When the room became quiet again, Joseph stood alone beside Veranzo's bed. The patient slowly opened his eyes. He looked directly at the doctor. "You made—" He struggled to breathe. "A mistake." Joseph couldn't answer. His heartbeat pounded louder than every machine around him. Veranzo continued, "I heard everything." He closed his eyes for a moment before speaking again. "If I survive, everyone will know." Those words echoed endlessly inside Joseph's mind, not because they were threatening, because they were true. His career, his reputation, everything he had spent years building could disappear overnight. For the first time in his life, fear became stronger than conscience. Hours later, the hospital had become unusually quiet. Most of the lights had been dimmed. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Veranzo was still alive, weak, barely conscious, but alive. Joseph stood outside the room for several long minutes. His breathing grew heavier. His thoughts became darker. Every possible future ended the same way. His name destroyed, his life ruined. He stepped back inside. Veranzo looked at him again. His voice was barely audible. "You promised I wouldn't die." Joseph lowered his head. "I'm sorry." Those were the last words Veranzo ever heard. By sunrise, the room was silent. No one questioned what had happened. Everyone believed Veranzo had simply lost his battle. But Joseph knew the truth. And from that moment on, the silence inside him never ended. Days passed. The funeral came and went. Life around the town continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Joseph returned home every evening pretending everything was normal. He forced himself to smile. He forced himself to sleep. He forced himself to forget. For nearly a week, nothing happened. No nightmares, no strange sounds, no guilt strong enough to break him. He began convincing himself that the secret would stay buried forever. Then, on the 8th night, everything changed. At exactly 3:13 a.m., Joseph woke suddenly. He wasn't sure why. The bedroom felt strangely cold. His digital clock flickered for a second before returning to normal. Outside, the rain had stopped. The entire neighborhood was silent. Too silent. Then, another knock. A single knock echoed from downstairs. Joseph sat upright. He listened carefully. Nothing. He laughed nervously. Probably an old pipe, maybe the wind. He lay back down. Another minute passed. Then, another 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not aggressive, almost patient. Joseph walked downstairs holding only a flashlight. The house was completely dark. Every room felt colder than before. He reached the front door. His hand rested on the doorknob. Slowly, he opened it. No one stood outside. Only empty darkness. He sighed in relief. Then his eyes moved downward. Lying perfectly in front of the door was a white hospital wristband covered with rainwater. Joseph picked it up. The plastic felt freezing cold. He turned it over. Printed across the faded label were only 2 words. Verranzo Cole. Joseph dropped it instantly. His breathing stopped. He stepped backward. The porch was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. He slammed the door shut and locked it. When he looked back at the floor, the wristband was gone. That night, Joseph never slept again because somewhere inside the dark silence of his house, he heard a familiar whisper, soft, weak, almost impossible to notice, yet unmistakably clear. "Doctor, you promised." Joseph stood frozen in the middle of his living room. The whisper had disappeared. The house was silent again. He looked around every corner, every hallway, and every room. Nothing was there. His heart slowly calmed. "It was just stress," he whispered to himself. "I've been working too much." He repeated those words over and over until sunrise. When daylight finally filled the house, everything looked normal again. The strange cold was gone. The whisper had vanished. There was no hospital wristband anywhere. For a moment, Joseph almost convinced himself that he had imagined the entire night, but deep inside, he knew he hadn't. The next few days felt ordinary. He returned to the hospital. He smiled at his coworkers. He treated patients as if nothing had happened. Yet something had changed. Every time he looked at a hospital bed, he remembered Verranzo's face. Every time someone whispered the word doctor, it sounded exactly like Verranzo's voice. He couldn't escape the memory. Another week passed. Then, 3:13 a.m. Joseph woke before the clock even struck the time. He didn't know why. It was as if something inside him already knew. The bedroom temperature dropped again. His breath became visible in the cold air. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Walking across the first floor. Each footstep echoed through the house. Joseph grabbed a flashlight and forced himself downstairs. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned. He searched every room. Nothing. As he turned toward the kitchen, he noticed something strange. The dining table had been neatly prepared for 2 people, 2 empty plates, 2 glasses of water, and 1 chair, slowly moved backward by itself. The sound of wood scraping across the floor sent chills through his body. Then, A voice came from the empty chair. Soft, calm, almost polite. "Sit down, doctor." Joseph run. He didn't look back. He locked himself inside his bedroom until sunrise. From that night on, the visits became regular. Always 3:13 a.m. Never earlier, never later. Each night, the house became a little less familiar. Sometimes every photograph hanging on the walls changed. Instead of family pictures, they showed Veranzo standing silently behind Joseph, not attacking, not smiling, just watching. The moment morning arrived, the pictures returned to normal. Another night. Joseph woke to the sound of water dripping. He followed the sound into the bathroom. The sink wasn't leaking. The shower wasn't running. Instead, dark water slowly flowed from the bathroom mirror itself. As the liquid slid downward, letters began appearing, one after another. "You remember." Joseph closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the mirror was clean. Nothing remained. His health began to collapse. He stopped sleeping. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes. His hands constantly shook. He could barely concentrate during the day. Even sunlight no longer brought him comfort. He feared the night. He feared the clock. Most of all, he feared 3:13. One evening, he decided not to stay home. "If the house is haunted, I'll simply leave." He drove for hours without any destination. Small towns, empty highways, gas stations, open fields. He refused to look at the time. Finally, he stopped beside a lonely roadside diner. The waitress smiled. "Coffee?" He nodded. As she placed the cup in front of him, she frowned. "Sir, is your friend joining you?" Joseph looked confused. "What friend?" She pointed toward the empty seat across from him. "I thought someone was sitting there." Joseph slowly turned. The chair was empty, but the cushion looked slightly pressed down, as if someone had stood up only seconds earlier. He immediately left. Back at home, the clock read 3:12 a.m. His heart nearly stopped. 1 minute, only 1 minute remained. He rushed inside and locked every door, every window. He turned on every light in the house. Nothing would enter tonight. The seconds passed. Then, 3:13. Every light switched off at the exact same moment. Darkness swallowed the house. Joseph couldn't even see his own hands. Then, one by one, the lights returned. But the house was no longer his. The wallpaper had vanished. The furniture was gone. The wooden floors had become cold white tiles. The air smelled like antiseptic. The walls looked exactly like hospital corridors. His own home had transformed into a hospital. Far away, a hospital monitor echoed. Beep sound. The sound grew louder, closer, closer. Joseph slowly walked toward it. At the end of the hallway stood a single hospital bed. Someone was lying beneath a white sheet. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep sounds. His legs refused to move, yet something invisible pulled him forward. Step by step, he approached the bed. His trembling hand reached for the sheet. He slowly pulled it back. Veranzo. His eyes were closed. His face looked exactly as it had on the night he died, cold, pale, still. Joseph stepped backward. I'm sorry." Nothing happened. Then, Veranzo's eyes opened, slowly, without blinking. He looked directly into Joseph's soul. His lips moved only once. Not yet. Instantly, every light exploded into darkness. Joseph screamed. When morning arrived, he found himself lying on the floor of his own living room. Everything looked normal again. The furniture had returned. The walls were unchanged. No hospital, no bed, no Veranzo. Only one thing remained. On the coffee table sat a folded piece of white paper. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, written in neat handwriting, were only 4 words. "Your turn is coming." Joseph stared at the message for several minutes. Then he heard something behind him. A whisper, so close, it felt like warm breath against his ear. "I'll see you tomorrow night." Joseph slowly turned around. No one was there. But for the first time, he realized something terrifying. Veranzo wasn't waiting inside the house anymore. He was already everywhere. The next morning, Dr. Joseph Hale looked like a completely different man. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled constantly. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow made him turn around. He stopped answering phone calls. He stopped speaking to anyone unless it was absolutely necessary. The only thing he could think about was the coming night. Every day now felt shorter. Every sunset felt like a countdown. And every time the clock moved closer to 3:13 a.m., his heart pounded harder. That evening, Joseph refused to sleep. He sat alone in his living room with every light turned on. The television played quietly in the background. He wasn't watching it. He was only waiting for the moment that always came. Midnight passed, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. The silence became unbearable. Then, the television screen suddenly filled with white static. The sound disappeared. Slowly, words began appearing across the screen. "The appointment is ready." The screen went black. Every light inside the house dimmed at the same time. The digital clock changed. 3:13 a.m. Slow knock echoed through the house. This time, Joseph didn't move. He closed his eyes. "I know you're here." The knocking stopped. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then a calm voice answered from somewhere inside the house. Not outside, not upstairs, not downstairs. It sounded as though the walls themselves were speaking. "Open your eyes, doctor." Joseph hesitated. Then, he slowly looked up. Standing at the far end of the hallway was Veranzo. For the first time, he appeared clearly. He wasn't covered in blood. He wasn't a monster. He simply looked like the patient Joseph had failed. His pale hospital clothes hung loosely from his body. His face was expressionless. Only his eyes looked unnatural. They never blinked. They never looked away. Joseph stepped backward. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this." Veranzo remained silent. He raised one hand, then slowly pointed toward the hallway. Without understanding why, Joseph began walking. Every step felt heavier than the last. The hallway seemed to stretch farther and farther. Doors appeared where no doors had ever existed. Each one slowly opened by itself. Inside every room, Joseph saw moments from his own past, his first day as a doctor, his graduation, patients thanking him, families smiling, everything he had once been proud of. Then, the memories changed. Every smiling face disappeared. Every room became darker. Every patient slowly turned into Veranzo. Dozens, then hundreds, all standing silently, watching him. None of them spoke. Their silence was worse than screaming. The hallway finally ended at a single white door. It opened on its own. Inside was a familiar hospital room, exactly as it had looked on the night Veranzo died. The same bed, the same chair, the same dim light above the ceiling. Veranzo walked inside first. Then he turned toward Joseph. For the first time, he spoke clearly. "You promised that I would live." Joseph fell to his knees. "I know. I was afraid. I chose myself instead of you." Tears rolled down his face. "I've lived with that choice every day." Veranzo stared at him in silence. Then he asked one final question. "Have you suffered?" Joseph lowered his head. "Every single night." The room became completely silent. Even the air felt still. Then Veranzo slowly nodded. I know. The hospital room began to disappear. The walls cracked. The ceiling dissolved into darkness. Cold wind rushed through the empty space. The entire house shook. Every clock inside the building stopped forever at 3:13. The whisper returned. Only this time, it came from every direction. Every choice leaves a shadow. Every promise has a price. The darkness surrounded Joseph. He could no longer see the floor beneath him. Only Veranzo remained visible, standing quietly in front of him. Joseph looked up. What happens now? Veranzo answered softly. The last patient never leaves. Until the doctor remembers the truth. Joseph closed his eyes. For the first time since that terrible night, he stopped running. He stopped denying. He accepted what he had done. The silence that followed felt endless. Then, Veranzo took one step backward, another and another. His figure slowly faded into the darkness. Before disappearing completely, he spoke one final sentence. Now you will remember. Forever. The next morning, neighbors noticed that Joseph's house was strangely quiet. No lights, no movement, no sound. The front door stood slightly open. Inside, everything looked perfectly normal. The furniture was untouched. The walls were clean. Nothing seemed unusual except for one room, the bedroom. There, sitting upright in a chair beside the window, was Dr. Joseph Hale. His eyes were open. His face was completely still. He looked as though he had been staring into the darkness for hours, perhaps days, perhaps longer. No one could explain what had happened during the night. But from that day forward, the house was abandoned. Years passed. The windows gathered dust. The garden became overgrown. People who walked past after midnight avoided looking toward the upstairs window. Because sometimes, at exactly 3:13 a.m., a light appeared inside the empty bedroom, and two figures could be seen standing silently by the window. One wore a doctor's coat, the other wore a pale hospital gown. Neither one moved, neither one spoke. They simply stood there, waiting, as though the last appointment had never truly ended.